By 1963, Youngstown, Ohio, a city that never held more than 170,000 people at its absolute peak, had absorbed more organized crime bombings in a single decade than almost any city in America outside of wartime, somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 separate blasts. That same city, within living memory, had produced more steel tubing than any other stretch of ground on the planet. Youngstown did not become a murder capital in spite of being a steel capital. It became one because of it. The money came so fast and answered to so few questions that it built two economies at once, running side by side for the better part of a century, sometimes on the same block. One of them made rails and pipe and armor plate. The other made corpses. Before either one finally collapsed, the men who ran the second economy would sit on city boards, drink at the same private clubs as judges, and in one especially brazen case, shoot a sitting county prosecutor inside his own home on Christmas Eve. Keep that name in mind. We'll come back to him. The town began, like so many others, with a surveyor and a purchase. In 1796, John Young, a land agent from Whitestown, New York, bought 15,560 acres in the Mahoning Valley from the Connecticut Land Company, the syndicate that was busy carving up the Connecticut Western Reserve into parcels for eastern speculators who had never laid eyes on the land they owned on paper. Young wanted farmland, a mill site, a modest settlement that would carry his name into the county records, and nothing grander than that. What he had actually purchased, without knowing it, was a seam of coal, a bed of iron ore, and a shelf of limestone lying almost directly on top of one another beneath the valley floor, the exact geological recipe required to make iron, and eventually steel, cheaper than almost anywhere else east of the Mississippi. By the 1840s, that accident of geology had turned the Young settlement into a collection of small blast furnace operations, charcoal-fired at first, then coal-fired, feeding a scattering of foundries that made stoves, rail, and agricultural tools for a growing Midwest. The completion of the Pennsylvania and Ohio Canal in 1840 gave the valley's iron a route to outside markets for the first time, and the railroads that arrived a decade later gave it a faster one. Youngstown was no longer just sitting on the right rocks. It was connected to everyone who wanted them. Young himself never saw much of what came from his purchase. He sold off parcels of his original acreage gradually over the following decades, and the settlement that took his name grew slowly at first. A crossroads township of a few hundred families for most of the early 1800s, distinguished mainly by its access to the Mahoning River and by the coal seams that ran close enough to the surface that early residents dug it out of their own hillsides, with hand tools for their stoves and forges. Nobody in that first generation of settlers described what they were building as an industrial capital. They described it as a decent place to farm, with the added convenience of enough local iron and coal to keep a blacksmith shop or a small foundry running without having to freight the raw material in from somewhere else. It would take another 3 generations, and men with considerably larger ambitions than John Young ever expressed, to turn that convenience into something the rest of the country would eventually have to reckon with. The transformation from furnace town to steel capital had 2 names attached to it, and the names mattered. In 1888, George Dennick and James Anson Campbell organized the Mahoning Valley Iron Company, determined to keep the region's industrial base in local hands rather than watch it get swallowed by outside capital the way so many smaller iron firms already had been. Wick was the public face, a colonel's title and a banking family behind him. Campbell was the operator, a man who understood blast furnace chemistry the way other men understood their own signatures. Their first venture didn't survive intact. 5 years in, it was absorbed by the Republic Iron and Steel Company, an early, humbling lesson in exactly how fast consolidation was moving through American industry at the turn of the century. Wick and Campbell tried again. On November 23, 1900, they founded the Youngstown Iron Sheet and Tube Company with $600,000 in capital, worth something in the neighborhood of $22 million today, built around one specific mission: keep Youngstown's steel Youngstowns, run by Youngstown men, answerable to Youngstown's own board rather than a head office in New York or Pittsburgh. In 1905, they dropped the word iron from the name entirely. Youngstown Sheet and Tube was born, and it would carry the city's fortunes, for better and eventually for much worse, for the next 77 years. Wick would not live to see what the company became. In April 1912, traveling home from a European tour meant to restore his failing health, he boarded a ship in Southampton with his wife, his daughter, and his cousin. The ship was the RMS Titanic. Wick did not survive the sinking. Campbell did, rising from company secretary to vice president to president, and under his direction, Youngstown Sheet and Tube grew into one of the largest steel producers in the country, eventually absorbing the Briar Hill Steel Company and expanding operations all the way into Indiana Harbor. By the 1940s, the company was the single largest employer in the entire state of Ohio, a distinction that would have seemed unthinkable to the 2 men who'd started with $600,000 and a desire to keep their hometown's mills out of somebody else's hands. It was never alone in the valley, either. Republic Steel and U.S.A. Steel, which had swallowed Youngstown's earlier National Steel Corporation almost as soon as U.S. Steel itself was chartered in 1901, ran their own mills along the same river. Together, the three companies stretched their furnaces and rolling mills across roughly 25 miles of the Mahoning Valley, an unbroken industrial corridor of smoke and orange light that residents could see glowing from the surrounding hills at night, as if the valley itself were on fire and had simply learned to live comfortably that way. The population followed the furnaces, and it followed them fast. Youngstown grew from a modest county seat into the 45th largest city in the United States, peaking in the 1930 census at 170,002 residents, packed into a city of steelworkers, mill managers, and the immigrant families who had crossed an ocean specifically to work the open hearths. Poles filled the streets around St. Casimir's. Greeks built their own Orthodox parish downtown. Italians settled Briar Hill so thoroughly that the neighborhood's name became a byword for the immigrant steel experience across the whole valley. Slovaks, Hungarians, and later a substantial wave of black families arriving from the South during the two world wars filled in the rest, drawn by wages that no farm back home, and often no factory job in the Jim Crow South either, could match. During the Second World War, the valley's mills ran at a pace that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier, pouring steel for tanks, ships, and shells around the clock, women stepping into open hearth and rolling mill jobs their fathers and husbands had left behind. The city built its civic architecture to match its ambitions. Grand movie palaces went up downtown. The Butler Institute of American Art opened its doors in 1919, the first museum in the country, built specifically to house American art rather than European imports. By the middle of the 20th century, Youngstown looked like a smaller, tougher cousin of Pittsburgh, another river valley that had traded its scenery for a payroll and never once apologized for the trade. Downtown reflected the same ambition. The Stamball Building, a 14-story office tower completed in 1907, became the headquarters of Youngstown Sheet and Tube itself. The company's name carved into the same skyline its steel had helped build in a dozen other cities. West Federal Street filled with movie palaces within a few blocks of one another. The Palace, the State, the Liberty, later renamed the Paramount, and the Warner, an extravagantly overbuilt 1931 movie house whose owners had originally planned a 20-story hotel on top of it, and whose systems alone were estimated to draw enough electricity to light 2,500 homes. Two flagship department stores, McKelvey's and Strauss's, anchored the shopping district and sold, as one local historian later put it, just about everything a booming middle class could want. For half a century, downtown Youngstown looked less like a mill town's afterthought and more like a small metropolis that had simply forgotten to become a bigger one. The valley's significance reached further than most residents realized at the time. In 1952, during the Korean War, President Harry Truman attempted to seize control of the nation's steel mills to prevent a labor strike from disrupting war production. And the mill owners' legal challenge to that seizure became one of the most consequential Supreme Court cases in American constitutional history. Youngstown Sheet and Tube Cutter Vith. Sawyer is still taught in law schools today as the definitive statement on the limits of presidential power, and it carries Youngstown's name permanently into the United States reports, not because the case was argued or decided there, but because the company that sued the President of the United States, and won, happened to carry the valley's name on its letterhead. It was a strange kind of immortality for a city that would spend the rest of the century being remembered for almost everything, except its own footnote in constitutional law. Picture the valley on a summer night in the mid-1950s, at the industry's absolute high watermark. From the hills above town, the mills along the Mahoning ran without pause, a chain of orange light stretching farther than a person could see in either direction, the sky above it stained a permanent smoky rose. The night shift changed at 11, streams of men in work clothes moving in one direction past streams of men moving in the other, lunch pails swinging, voices in Polish and Italian, and Slovak overlapping in the parking lots. The heat off an open hearth furnace could be felt from 100 feet away even in January. Men worked 12-hour turns, 6 days a week in some departments, for wages that had built the modest brick houses climbing the hillsides on either side of the valley, houses with grape arbors and vegetable gardens planted by people who still remembered, or whose parents still remembered, a version of Europe that offered nothing like this. It was dangerous work. It was also, for 2 generations running, the best work most of these families had ever had access to. And the valley organized its entire sense of itself around the fact that the furnaces would keep burning, because as far as anyone standing in that light could tell, they always had. But the same conditions that made Youngstown rich also made it almost impossible to govern honestly. Unlike Cleveland or Pittsburgh, cities large enough to be dominated outright by a single organized crime family with the muscle to enforce order on its own turf, Youngstown was too small and too valuable to belong to anyone. It became a battlefield instead. Rival factions out of Cleveland and Pittsburgh, along with homegrown operators loyal to neither, fought for control of the valley's gambling and numbers rackets starting in the 1930s. Through the 1940s, the Jungle Inn, a gambling den tucked just over the county line in Trumbull County, specifically to complicate any single sheriff's jurisdiction over it, became one of the most popular illegal casinos in the Midwest, drawing gamblers from 3 states, while local officials collected their share and looked elsewhere. For a while, the competition for the Valley's rackets stayed relatively contained. A quiet war fought mostly over what locals called the bug, the daily numbers lottery that ran through corner stores and barbershops from one end of the valley to the other. Then, in the 1950s, 2 rival policy racketeers, Sandy Naples and Vince De Niro, went to war over control of that racket, and the valley discovered a new use for dynamite. The bombs were meant to intimidate at first, warning shots aimed at storefronts and parked cars, not people. By the end of the 1950s, the pattern had become so routine that a local radio station began running its own public service announcement. A jarring blast of sound followed by a plea to stop the violence. It didn't stop. It escalated. In the early 1960s, the same bombs that had once been used to frighten rivals started being used to kill them, and the killing did not stay confined to the racketeers themselves. On the day after Thanksgiving in 1962, a car bomb tore through a vehicle belonging to Charles Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro, a local racketeer, killing him instantly. His 11-year-old son, riding beside him, died alongside his father. A 3rd son survived, maimed for life. The killing of a child made the story impossible to contain to the local papers. It traveled. In March of 1963, the Saturday Evening Post sent a writer who had already made his name chronicling the life of Al Capone to find out what was happening in a mid-sized Ohio steel town. What he found earned Youngstown a nickname that would outlive every mill in the valley: Crimetown, U.S.A. The story cataloged dozens of bombings and more than 10 killings within a single decade. And it noted something outsiders found almost impossible to believe, that city officials, police officers, and the racketeers themselves moved through the same restaurants, the same social clubs, sometimes the same family gatherings, with no particular effort made to hide it. Youngstown had already been called Bombtown by then. It had already been called Murdertown. Now it had a name with a national magazine circulation behind it. And among law enforcement nationally, the car bombing itself became so specifically associated with the valley that it earned its own piece of grim slang, a shorthand term for what happened when the underworld decided someone needed removing. Meander Reservoir, the artificial lake that supplied much of the valley's drinking water, developed a second, unofficial reputation as a convenient place to make a problem disappear beneath the surface. A rumor residents traded for decades without ever quite being able to prove it and without ever quite being able to dismiss it either. The corruption did not confine itself to racketeers and their rivals. It reached directly into the machinery of local government, and it stayed there for decades longer than most outsiders ever realized. In the early 1980s, Mahoning County's own sheriff, James Trafficant Jr., a Youngstown native and former college and semi-pro football player known around town for his size and his temper, long before he was known for anything else, was indicted on federal charges of taking bribes from organized crime figures in exchange for looking the other way. Rather than hire a lawyer, Trafficant defended himself at trial. A man with no legal training standing in front of a jury insisting he had taken the mob's money only as part of a one-man undercover sting operation against them, evidence of his own devising. Somehow, it worked. He was acquitted in 1983, and the acquittal turned him into exactly what the Valley badly wanted at that exact moment: a local folk hero, a man who had allegedly beaten both the mafia and the federal government using the same set of facts. 2 years later, Youngstown sent him to Congress, and Washington had never seen anything quite like him. He wore denim suits with high-water trousers onto the House floor. He topped his head with a hairpiece so conspicuously artificial that reporters wrote about it almost as often as they wrote about his legislation. None of it hurt him back home. If anything, it helped. The Valley had spent decades being mocked in the national press as Crimetown and Bombtown, and here was a man from Youngstown itself standing in the halls of Congress, unashamed, unpolished, and impossible to ignore, turning the same qualities that made outsiders laugh into a kind of armor. He would serve 9 terms, 17 years, through the worst economic decline any American district endured in the 20th century, railing on the House floor against the closures and the layoffs and the outside forces he blamed for hollowing out his hometown, punctuating his speeches with a trademark line, "Beam me up," that made him a minor national celebrity even as his own district kept shrinking beneath him year after year. Voters loved him for it, term after term, re-election after re-election, long after other Rust Belt districts had turned on their incumbents. Then, in 2001, the federal government indicted him again, this time on 10 counts, including racketeering, bribery, conspiracy, and tax evasion. Once more, he defended himself without a law degree, arguing to the jury, as he had nearly 2 decades earlier, that the case against him was a vendetta. This time, it did not work. On April 11th, 2002, a jury convicted him on all 10 counts, and Congress expelled him 3 months later, only the 4th member in American history to suffer that fate. He served 7 years in federal prison. Even then, even after the conviction, a meaningful number of people in Youngstown never stopped defending him, because to them, Trafficant hadn't represented corruption. He had represented a city that felt like the entire country had already written it off, fighting back in the only language it had left, however crooked that language turned out to be. And still, remarkably, none of that had touched the industry that built the city in the first place. Not yet. The mills kept running, the rackets kept running beside them, but downtown had already begun to hollow out on its own years before a single furnace went cold. In 1950, the Boardman Plaza opened just south of the city, the first shopping center built by a local developer named Edward J. DeBartolo, who would go on to become one of the wealthiest mall builders in the country. The Southern Park Mall and the Eastwood Mall opened in the early 1970s, and with ample free parking and none of downtown's congestion, they pulled shoppers, and eventually entire store chains, away from West Federal Street years before the mills themselves were in any danger. McKelvey's and Strauss's would not survive the decade that followed. Neither would most of the movie palaces. The Warner played its final film, fittingly enough Bonnie and Clyde, on February 28, 1968, though a donation from a local couple would save the building itself and turn it into the permanent home of the Youngstown Symphony. The Liberty and the State were not so fortunate, standing vacant for decades before the city finally tore them down, replaced, like so much of downtown, by parking lots for buildings that no longer existed. It would take one more single morning to finish what the malls had started. On September 19, 1977, a date the Valley would come to call Black Monday, the steel economy collapsed, and it did not collapse slowly. Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which had been sold out of local hands to the Likes Corporation of New Orleans back in 1969, announced without warning that it was closing its Campbell Works. Out-of-town executives flew into the Pittsburgh airport, held a board meeting a few dozen miles from the workers whose lives they were about to upend, and by the end of that week, roughly 5,000 people had lost their jobs, men who had walked into their shift that Monday morning, expecting nothing more unusual than an ordinary day. The mill did not wind down over months of warnings. It simply stopped. Inside the plant that Monday, the news arrived the way most catastrophic news arrives in a workplace, secondhand, in fragments, passed from one crew to the next faster than any official announcement could travel. Men who had spent 20 and 30 years inside the same set of gates, who had followed their fathers through the same hiring office, found out their careers had ended not from a supervisor, but from a co-worker who'd heard it from someone in payroll. There was no severance ceremony, no gold watch. None of the dignity a shutdown of that scale might have been given if anyone in New Orleans had thought the workers deserved advance warning. Some men drove home and told their wives before dinner. Some drove around the valley for hours first, unsure how to say it out loud. Black Monday was only the opening blow. The Briar Hill Works, Sheet and Tube's other major Youngstown plant, followed at the end of 1979, its open hearths going cold for the last time. U.S. Steel's Ohio Works was idled that same year. The closure announced to workers the day before Thanksgiving 1979. The very last heat of steel poured in the first week of March 1980. A coalition of clergy, community leaders, and steelworkers, led by the attorney Stoughton Lind, sued in federal court to force U.S. Steel to sell the idle mill to the workers who wanted to keep it running themselves. An audacious, and for a moment, genuinely hopeful attempt to buy back their own jobs. The court ruled against them, U.S. Steel refused to sell at any price. On April 28, 1982, dynamite charges brought down the last 4 standing blast furnaces of the Ohio Works, an almost unbearable echo of the bombs the Valley already knew far too well, except this time no one went to prison for it, because it was perfectly, unremarkably legal. The McDonald Works closed in 1981. Republic Steel's furnace went dark that same year, and the company itself filed for bankruptcy within a few years after that. Within 5 years of Black Monday, every steel mill of consequence in the Mahoning Valley had shut its gates for good. More than 10,000 primary steelmaking jobs disappeared in that stretch alone. And once the ripple effects reached the suppliers, the machine shops, the diners, and the retailers that had depended for generations on steelworkers' paychecks, the region lost an estimated 40,000 jobs in total, and roughly 400 satellite businesses along with them. Unemployment in the valley climbed as high as 22%, a figure closer to the Great Depression than to any post-war recession anyone in Youngstown had lived through. Even the small joys went. Idora Park, the amusement park where generations of Youngstown children had spent their summers riding the wooden Wildcat roller coaster, had survived for decades on the strength of a local economy that no longer existed by the 1980s. In April 1984, a welder's spark ignited the Wildcat, destroying it along with the lost river flume ride and the park's administrative offices. Idora opened one final, diminished season that summer anyway, a wounded version of itself running on borrowed time, and closed its gates for good on September 3rd, 1984. The city that had once lit the night sky with blast furnace flame couldn't keep its own amusement park's lights on through a single more winter. The workers who could leave, left. Sons and daughters who had grown up assuming they would follow their parents into the mills the way their parents had followed grandparents packed up for Columbus, for Cincinnati, for the Sunbelt cities that were adding jobs as fast as Youngstown was shedding them. The ones who stayed tended to be the ones who couldn't easily go, older workers too close to pension eligibility to start over elsewhere, homeowners with mortgages worth less than what they owed on them, families with roots too deep in a specific parish or a specific street to transplant easily. Over time, that selection effect reshaped the entire city, aging it, emptying it out from the middle rather than the edges, until Youngstown had proportionally more retirees and fewer working-age adults than almost anywhere else in the state. The mob, unlike the steel companies, had no factory to shutter and no capital equipment to write off. It simply kept operating in a city with fewer and fewer legitimate jobs left to compete with it, and its final, most brazen chapter didn't unfold until nearly 2 decades after Black Monday, long after most Americans assumed Youngstown's mafia days belonged safely to the past. In August 1991, a sniper's bullet killed reigning Youngstown mob boss Joey Naples, and Lenny Strollo, a Pittsburgh family associate who had spent years quietly assembling his own network of judges, prosecutors, and police officials on the payroll, moved into the vacancy. Strollo ran the Valley's rackets for most of the 1990s, with a level of institutional penetration that made the bombing wars of the 1950s look almost primitive by comparison. And when a young, independent-minded prosecutor named Paul Gaines won election in Mahoning County on a promise to finally break the mob's grip on the courthouse, Strollo's organization decided he needed to be removed before he ever took office. On Christmas Eve, 1996, a gunman broke into Gaines's home and shot him. Gaines survived, badly wounded, and was sworn in as prosecutor on schedule anyway. The attack on a sitting prosecutor-elect inside his own house on a holiday meant for family was the moment federal investigators finally had enough public outrage behind them to move against a criminal network that had operated, in one form or another, for the better part of a century. Strollo, facing the weight of a 4-year FBI investigation and watching his own associates cut deals with prosecutors around him, made a choice no Youngstown mob boss before him had ever made. He agreed to testify against his own organization. Over nearly 8 hours on the witness stand, he described a criminal enterprise that had operated in plain sight for generations, and his cooperation helped federal prosecutors convict more than 70 corrupt officials across the Mahoning Valley, judges, prosecutors, police officers, law directors, the entire architecture of a local justice system that had been for sale for as long as most residents could actually remember. Strollo pleaded guilty to racketeering and tax charges in 2004 and served nearly 13 years in federal prison, released in 2012 to a valley that barely resembled the one he'd once controlled. He died in 2021 at 90 years old, and the county prosecutor, whose own murder he had once ordered, called it, simply and without much apparent bitterness, the end of an era. What the investigation ultimately exposed went beyond any single bribe or any single bombing. It showed a system in which a defendant could reliably learn which judge would hear his case before it was even assigned, in which police captains had price lists, in which the line between the courthouse and the rackets had effectively stopped existing sometime around the Eisenhower administration, and nobody in power had found much reason to redraw it since. By then, there was very little of that era left standing to end. From a peak of 170,002 residents in 1930, Youngstown's population fell past 150,000, then to roughly 115,000 by 1980, in the immediate wake of Black Monday, then past 100,000, then past 80,000, a decline so sustained and so total that by the mid-2020s, the city had shrunk to somewhere around 58,000 residents, a loss of nearly 2/3 of its peak population, and a fall from the 45th largest city in the country to somewhere outside the top 600. The poverty rate in Youngstown today sits above 36%, more than double the statewide average. Median household income hovers around $34,000 a year. Entire residential blocks that once housed steelworkers and their families now sit vacant, some of them demolished entirely by the city's land bank, in a decades-long effort to manage a housing stock that was built for a population 3 times the size of the one that remains within it. Since the 2000s, that land bank has torn down more than 7,000 vacant houses, an entire small city's worth of housing removed board by board and lot by lot, most of it concentrated on the east side and around the old mill neighborhoods, where steelworkers' homes once stood 3 and 4 to a block. Even the institution that had chronicled all of it, the bombings, Black Monday, the Trafficant trials, the Strollo testimony, did not survive to write the next chapter. The Vindicator, Youngstown's daily newspaper, had published continuously since 1869, founded by a printer who'd been run out of a Pennsylvania town for his politics, and arrived in Youngstown feeling, in his own telling, vindicated. For 150 years, through Crimetown and the mill closures and every courthouse scandal in between, it never missed an edition. In the summer of 2019, its owners announced that after a century and a half of dogged, occasionally dangerous local reporting, the paper could no longer survive financially. Its final edition ran on August 31st, 2019, the same year the city's Northside Medical Center shut its doors and General Motors closed its massive assembly plant in nearby Lordstown, two more institutions the valley had assumed were permanent fixtures of the landscape. A city that had once generated enough news to fill a national magazine feature could no longer generate enough advertising revenue to fill its own local paper. What remains of Youngstown today is not quite the ruin outsiders sometimes imagine, and not quite the comeback story its boosters sometimes claim, but something more complicated, sitting somewhere in between. The Youngstown Business Incubator, launched downtown in the early 2000s, has helped seed several hundred technology jobs in a local economy still dominated by healthcare, retail, and whatever manufacturing survived the collapse. America Makes, a National Institute for Additive Manufacturing and 3D Printing, chose Youngstown for its headquarters. A small, symbolically loaded decision to plant the future of American industry inside the husk of its industrial past. Youngstown State University, which absorbed thousands of displaced steelworkers and their children into its classrooms over the decades, remains the largest employer left standing in a city that once measured its workforce in blast furnace shifts rather than course credits. More recently, the steel tube manufacturer Vallourec announced an expansion of its Youngstown operations, and a new innovation hub for aerospace and defense is projected to bring several hundred more jobs to the area by the end of the decade. A small, almost stubborn insistence that the valley's relationship with heavy industry isn't entirely finished, even now. The Stambaugh Building, the 14-story tower that once carried the Youngstown sheet and tube name across the downtown skyline, reopened in 2018 as a 4-star hotel, its lobby now welcoming travelers who have no particular reason to know what the building used to mean, or who built it, or why. Drive along the Mahoning River today, and the mills themselves are mostly gone, not preserved as landmarks, but demolished for scrap and liability, leaving long stretches of quietly reclaimed land where 25 miles of continuous industry once burned through the night sky without pause. Meander Reservoir still supplies the valley's water, calm and unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know its other reputation. The steel capital that built two economies at once, one of pipe and rail, one of bombs and payoffs, spent the better part of a century unable to survive, without either running alongside the other. Both are gone now, or nearly gone, dismantled not by any single dramatic event, but by decades of decisions made in boardrooms and courtrooms, hundreds of miles from the valley itself. What's left is a city that has spent nearly 50 years learning to be smaller than it was ever built to be, still standing on the same river, still lit some nights by nothing more than ordinary streetlights, in the exact spots where the furnace glow used to be.